Rabbi Lawrence Kushner makes the claim that religion without humor is blasphemous. And I don't think the good rabbi was referring to preachers making fools out of themselves, tripping on the way up to the pulpit, or over scripture, or goofy theologies, or really bad puns. What I think he meant was that God is in all of life and shines most particularly in the good and the joyful. And if we stifle humor in our religion, we do a great disservice to God and to ourselves. Humor is a good and a godly gift. And to deny it is to deny a part of God's creation and a blessing for humanity. And those of you who have been here before have probably figured out by now that I love humor. I look for it and I embrace it almost wherever I can. I used to read the Bible and privately laugh at the humor that is embedded in a surprising number of places. And I did this in private for years out of fear that we're not supposed to guffaw while we're contemplating the sacred stories of our faith. But in seminary, I decided to come out of that comedic, canonical closet. Mainly because in seminary I kept seeing more and more humor in the Bible. And I began to wonder about a theology of humor being laced in the Bible. Theology is the study of divine things or religious truth. And humor is comic or absurd situations causing amusement. So, if you will, a theology of humor amounts to the study of divine things or religious truth in comic and absurd situations. Not all of the Bible is funny, of course, but there's quite a bit of humor placed in there. However, as a whole, churches don't often consider the Bible as containing both religious truths and humor, but it does. And it's sad to me that our cultural ethos of piety seems to keep us from seeing or acknowledging biblical humor. We've been taught to check our sense of humor at the door. Well, we laugh at little jokes, but churches, by and large, usually stick with serious views of the Bible. And by doing so, we miss out on some fun stuff that's in there. And all of this leads me to ask if God and the authors didn't put it in there for our use, what's humor doing in the Bible? You think about it. Humans in the Bible are often involved in the comic or the absurd, from a talking serpent in Eden to David donning an oversized suit of armor to Balaam's arguing with a donkey to Jesus asking, how can we see a speck in our neighbor's eye when we have a log in our own? The absurd and the comedic are woven into parts of the Bible. In fact, a number of stories in the Bible use humor to teach, not just to amuse. And a good example is Jesus, who uses humor to teach and to preach and to protest. And humor is a great teaching tool. It can help us see ourselves better sometimes in a laughable situation than through direct criticism. It's more than just teaching. Laughter is good for us and apparently for God. Psalm 2 states that the God who sits in heaven will laugh. And as images of God, we also laugh. It's a gift from God. Job 8 notes that God fills our mouths with laughter. And indeed, there's much power in humor. Science has long reported that laughter is healthy. Friends and family and lifelong mates share humor together, and so do communities. It helps teach, it helps our bonding, it relieves stress and allows us to share in common a good laugh. And I think that God laughs with us, and Jesus as well, as we gather two or more in His name. And humor does more than make us feel good and teach. Humor can be subversive if it's used to point out the absurdity of an oppressor's position or positions, to make the oppressors less than the lofty gods of power that they or we might imagine that they are, and give up a new vision to alter standards of what is truly powerful. And we know that God acts in ways that are subversive. From Exodus to the cross, God subverts the status quo. And he calls us to do so too. God and God's people often use humor to subvert the status quo in the Bible. In the Old Testament, mighty Pharaoh's family unknowingly rescues, adopts, and raises a poor Hebrew child who ironically ends up as Moses, the leader of liberation and the law. And in the New Testament, mighty Herod is driven nuts in his unsuccessful hunt for a weak, poor baby born to be a king in a stinking stable. The powerful and the oppressive rich of Jesus' day have as good a chance of getting into heaven as, and really picture this, stuffing a camel through the eye of a needle. It's not just people either. The powerful reign of heaven is like a tiny mustard seed, not golden palaces on high. It's like yeast spreading in flour, not having wealth or armies and more of that than anyone else. And all these images I've just listed have an ironic, humorous edge to them. Just like a bad hell's angel like Samaritan can be a better neighbor than religious leaders. The story of the Good Samaritan is more than just humorous. It calls us to see the world differently. Samaritans were known to be bad hombres in Jesus' culture. They were loathed enemies. And Jesus uses irony to flip that notion around. Those we loathe are not only as human as us, but capable of being God's agents for good, and even better than the culturally exalted religious elites in that story. Putting it in today's context, a story entitled something like The Good Hell's Angel has this cognitive dissonance to it that's funny. If you've ever seen the musical Godspell, and you've experienced a good deal of humor straight from the Gospels, properly done, the first act of that Broadway show is virtually one punchline after the other, mostly out of the book of Matthew. And if properly done, it's also very love-centered and spiritual, as well as scriptural and full of teaching moments. If we ignore our cultural piety, it really doesn't take that much to see the humor of Jesus in Jesus' stories. For example, in Godspell, the story of Lazarus and the rich man plays out just like it can when we read it, with the selfish, non-neighbor-loving rich guy, haughty as all get out before death, and then in death, just as haughty, only more foolishly so. Through Jesus' humor, we see the rich man's selfish conduct is foolish not only in Hades, but in life as well. There's humor in Jesus' stories. And that brings me to today's reading. And I have to give you some background to understand why the Palm Sunday story is not just poignant and powerful, but can also be heard as laced with humor. It's to start a Passover week, and everybody who is anybody is arriving in Jerusalem for the celebration. And not just devout celebrants, mind you, but rabble-rousers and rebels. And not just Jews, but Roman legions. Pilate, the Roman governor of Palestine, arrives from Caesarea to oversee the added troops and the volatile multitude. Pilate's procession into Jerusalem is no doubt in a stately fashion, mounted on a well-groomed horse, leading an entourage of spiffed-up legions with all the pomp and circumstance and shiny, gleaming metal befit a man of worldly power and wealth. Pilate comes into Jerusalem from the west in an imperial pageantry, representing not just imperial power, but imperial theology. In Rome, Emperor Augustus was understood to be the Son of God, and so were his successors. Augustus' successor in Jesus' day was Tiberius, who bore the same divine titles as Augustus. And so Pilate embodied not only the power of Rome and the worldly reality of the very few wealthy oppressed, the rest social order, but he also represented a rival theology to Judaism, and rival gods were his, rivals to Yahweh. Pilate's entry to Jerusalem is mad. It's countered by Jesus' supremely ironic and symbolic entry as the representative of a reign in conflict with Rome. The reign of God. God versus human power. Peace versus war. Non-violence versus violence. Jesus versus Caesar. Pilate's parade is met in every way with opposite visual splendors by a parade of Jesus and his multitude of adoring followers. Think about it. How does Jesus come marching in today's story? Matthew tells it a little bit different than the children's version I read. In Matthew, as we heard, we're told that the disciples, and I'm quoting here, brought him the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. According to Matthew, Jesus sat astride a big and a small donkey. And lots of folks see the description of Jesus riding two animals at once as an oversight or a lack of care by Matthew. But you see, well, I'm kind of like Uncle Albert in Mary Poppins. I love to laugh. And it seems to me a fair read that Matthew is bright enough to get the absurdity of the visual image that his words paint. Jesus humbly seated simultaneously somehow astride both a grown donkey and a smaller colt. It's like a circus clown parody. A first century Saturday Night Live lampoon. Jesus arrives from the east. He comes in opposite fashion than the pompous promenade with Pilate parading in on a prancing, overpreened pony. This is an image of Jesus having fun with the overtop opulence, the pomp and circumstance of Pilate by being over the top in his own way, a very, very opposite way to Caesar's show of authority. Like a lot of comedy, it's humor used to carry a serious message. God's reign is not like any earthly power's reign. That's Jesus' message over and over and over again in the Gospels. And John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, in their remarkable book, which I highly recommend, The Last Week, suggests that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem was a staged political demonstration. And what could Jesus have been demonstrating against? Well, how about the notion that might makes right, that wealth rules the world and that God supports such injustices? Jesus' statement seems to be God's leaders, God's Son, are not in Rome's power, are not in Caesar. God does not reign with worldly ways of military might and oppressive wealth. God's chosen are way, way different than the man and the men who lead Rome. The real Son of God comes from the opposite direction as Pilate, and he protests with scorn, even a fun sort of mocking of the ways of oppression and violence. That's why in Matthew, Jesus comes all goofy looking, humble and poor, not mighty, and awkward to boot on two animals, inexpensive, ordinary bursts of Eden, a beast of burden, a donkey and a colt, and someone else even owns. And understanding this helps us understand Jesus comes to people full of fun, and life, and care, and love. This is a fun and compassionate king, willing to stand up to Rome. He's got guts. Jesus comes to people who lay before him the very coats off their back with natural limbs, palm fronds from God's creation, traditional first century Palestine red carpet, if you will. And we're told as Jesus entered the city, the crowds that went ahead of him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." And I guarantee you that no crowd in Jerusalem greeted Pilate with that type of genuine fervor. Genuine fear, perhaps, but not fervor. Hosanna is a joyful sound. It's a word that means, oh, save now. And Jesus, on his humble and humorous, gutsy ride into Jerusalem, is understood to be the one who can save, not Pilate, but Jesus. Jesus' way of love and nonviolence and inclusivity is radically in opposition to Rome's show of crushing human power and opulence. Jesus' extremely different way is understood as the way of salvation. On that first Palm Sunday, there was a choice. And it's the same choice we have today. The way of unjust imperial violence offered by the Pilates of the world who dominate by exclusivity, elitism, and force, or the radical way of God's inclusivity, the God who reigns through nonviolent justice and love, who aims us toward peace where all have well-being. All have well-being. And Jesus can be understood to have made a seriously funny entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So funny we can smile at it still. So effective in its underlying seriousness that it caused the oppressive multitude to yell out, "Hosanna! Save now!" And Jesus' humorous protest made his point. Choose Caesar or choose God. And these are two very, very different choices. Caesar's peace through violence, or God's peace through non-violence. And those yelling Hosanna made the joyful sound of choosing God's peace. And we can make that choice too and choose to yell out Hosanna. I know it might make some of you uncomfortable, but you're going to sing it later, so I'm going to ask you to do it now. Humor me. Hold up your palms and wave them. And on the 3, shout Hosanna. 1, 2, 3. Hosanna! I don't know about you, but I cannot think of a better prayer than, "Oh, save now." Hosanna. Amen.